Hi there, this is Rajeswari Ramani, editor of Asian Meat Magazine and Alternative Protein. Welcome to another edition of Asian Agribiz Podcast. We are here today to speak to Matthew Clark from the Feed Guys about formulating and sourcing alternative ingredients in broiler diets. But how do they compare to conventional ingredients? Hi Matthew, can you tell us in terms of variability and nutrient quality, when do we use or not use DDGS and what are the main factors to consider?
Oh, hi, Rush. Yeah, thanks for including me in the podcast. DDGS is one of those ingredients that is sometimes considered now as an alternative ingredient, and other parts in the industry it's considered a standard ingredient. I was challenged on my presentation by one person who said DDGS is not an alternative, DDGS is mainstream. So it is common. We have to say that at the beginning, I think. But when we look at the variability in DDGS, we have to understand, I think, the structure of the industry. And there is no standard manufacturing process, although they are rather similar between the different plants. So some of the variability you might experience is due to purchasing ingredients from different locations. And different locations do have different processes. They will have different nutrient levels. And these will affect particularly the fiber and the fat. And the fiber and the fat levels will affect the energy levels and the protein levels as well. So my first piece of advice to anyone who is using DDGS is try to organize with your supplier to buy from one location. And then you will find that the variability reduces quite well, down to the point where it's very similar to buying wheat bran or wheat pollard. There's a bit of variation, but it's quite acceptable. We need to remember that DDGS is not used in high quantities, and therefore the variation doesn't have a big impact at the end in the formula. So generally speaking, the variability that we talk about in DDGS is largely being overcome by a move towards all of the plants in the US are working with fat reduction, taking out the fat or spinning the fat at the end of the process. And this leads to a more consistent protein, fat and energy levels between the different locations. But if we can buy from one plant, it's better. The second thing we need to do is to understand with our particular shipments, what is the true value of the DDGS to get an accurate formula. And we've got NIR tools now that enable us to do a large number of samples at very low cost. So we can understand the digestibility and the variability better from these tools, and we can update the matrix more frequently. So one of the things we have to recognize with variability of ingredients is that we need to be knowing at all times what it is that we're using right now. And if we use the NIR technology and also we put that data into the formulation system, we can largely overcome these potential problems. So when to use, when not to use, it is largely a matter of price. Now, we know from history that DDGS is trading about 1.05, 1.1 to the corn price. And conventional wisdom says if it goes above 1.2 multiplier of the corn price, then it starts to become economic. But actually, if we look at these new classes of DDGS coming through, that number is about 1.35 multiplier. So as a rough guide, if our multiplier from the DDGS price to the corn price is say 1.2, 1.3, we will be in the money by using DDGS. So in the end, if we have managed our variability well, it comes down to cost. And we can see that the export market, for example, for DDGS is very strong to Southeast Asia, and it's become a very well accepted ingredient. And the variability doesn't appear to cause too many issues. There is one strategy that I've come across which is useful, which is to slightly undervalue the DDGS so that when you're formulating the feed, it will always slightly exceed expectations. And even under those conditions, DDGS is still a popularly used ingredient.
Okay, so I would like to go to the next question and ask about brown rice efficacy in the broiler diets. So why is brown rice suitable, and in what stages do we consider using it?
It's a very interesting ingredient. Brown rice, of course, has been going into human foods pretty much since rice started being grown many thousands of years ago. And it's only recently with the turmoil in the grain markets that we've started to look at brown rice as a feed ingredient. Now let's go back to the agronomy first. Rice as a crop is one of the highest yielding dry matter crops that we can grow. It can produce about 22 tons of dry matter per hectare. It's very high. And typically for Asia, we can produce about 5 tons of brown rice grain per hectare. So it is a high yielding crop compared to growing corn in the tropics, which is lower. Agronomically also, the rice crops require less chemicals to control pests, less chemicals to control weeds and diseases. It's quite a hardy crop. So as we look at brown rice in the food chain, it's got an inherent safety to it because we're using less chemicals in the production. It also has more sustainability because there isn't the same constant threat of disease and the weed control problems. It's done naturally by, of course, by flood irrigation, and it's a very hardy plant. So it does make it a very good candidate as an ingredient for use, certainly in food, but an alternative for use in animal feeds. Now, historically, we haven't looked at it because the supply of corn has been very good. For the past 20, 30 years, we've had almost as much corn as we need. And only recently has it started to become challenging in terms of volume. So we look at the brown rice. Now, you compare them side by side. The gross energy of brown rice is almost identical to the gross energy of corn. And so the ME value turns out to be slightly higher because the protein is higher and the starch is a little higher. Fat levels around about 3.5%. And to all intents and purposes, it is a very similar profile to corn. I say it has slightly higher protein. It also has lower fiber. So there's no anti-nutritional factor, certainly, in broken rice that we need to worry about. Interestingly, when we start formulating and making substitutions, the brown rice gives a slightly better feed conversion. The more brown rice we substitute for corn, the better the feed conversion. And it's making a difference when we go from 0 substitution to 100% substitution of about 5 points of FCR. So brown rice is better. It's certainly no worse than using corn. So what it comes down to is I think, two factors in using brown rice. One is the farmer willing to grow more brown rice? That's the first. I'll grow more rice and therefore brown rice. That's the first thing. And secondly, is the market for rice in the human food sector saturated to the point where we have excess paddy rice available? Now, under those conditions, when we have excess, the price is likely to be favorable towards use in animal feeds. So technically, it's a great substitution. And it comes down to cost, basically. So we'll be looking at a multiplier of about 102, 105 is the point at which brown rice becomes feasible in the formulation. I think at the moment, the pricing is somewhat higher than corn, so we wouldn't necessarily look at it in formulation. But if the corn price were to rise and paddy rice were to stay still, brown rice becomes a very viable option that we know technically we can handle in the feed. It can be handled in interesting ways, actually, because the brown rice grain is rather similar to the size of a wheat grain. It's very similar to the size of a typical broiler pellet, and we can just add whole rice into a formula, into a feed in manufacturing, and it seems to have some effect on the gut health by giving this whole grain feeding system to the birds. So yes, I think the brown rice has great potential as a feed ingredient, an alternative to corn, a good alternative. Performance is slightly better, and the final decision will boil down to the relative costs between the two ingredients.
Okay, Matthew, those are some very good information on both brown rice and DDGS. Thank you for coming on board today to enlighten us, and I hope you have a nice day further.
Well, thank you, Rash. My pleasure to be with you.
I hope you took note of the pertinent points that we presented here about DDGS and brown rice. Do share this podcast with your colleagues and the industry and come back to see what else we have in store for you. This is Rush, signing off for Asian Agribiz.